We've had a great day today hosting Masood Ahmed, who is the president of the Centre for Global Development based in Washington, DC. Masood joined Centre for Global Development early 2017 after a 35-year career working for the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, the World Bank, and United Kingdom's Department for International Development, or DFID. He's uniquely placed to be answering some questions today on financing of the SDGs. It's great to have you here today, Masood.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mark.
Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals requires considerable resources. Their scope includes health, education, poverty reduction, food security, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, infrastructure, energy security, climate change action, reforming institutions, to name not all. Achieving these will be prohibitively expensive for developing countries. So who's going to finance the SDGs?
I think it's useful maybe to just step back first and say that reaching agreement on the post-2030 agenda, which is articulated in the SDGs, the fact that the world as a whole has come together and said, this is where we'd like to be. And it's an agenda not for developing countries, by developed countries, not for the poor, by the rich, but it's an agenda that everybody's bought into, because the SDGs, unlike the MDGs that came, the Millennial Development Goals that came before them, are for every country to try and reach. So I think it was a huge achievement, and it's also a very important mechanism for holding countries accountable for how they organize themselves, for the policies they follow, for the money they spend, for themselves and for others. So I do want to kind of start from that. And then it's not going to be easy. Maybe it's a bit easier for some countries that are closer to those SDGs and have more resources. Certainly for low-income countries, many countries in Africa, countries in Asia, countries in the Pacific, which are constrained by resources and have more of a distance to travel to get to the SDGs. It'll be a more challenging journey. And I think while clearly the rest of the world has to help in financing it, and I'll get in a minute to how they might do that, the bulk of the financing is going to come from the countries themselves. That's the history of development. The history of development is that most countries develop on the back of their own savings and on the back of their efforts of their own people. And the rest of the world, whether it's through bilateral assistance, through the actions of multilateral institutions like the World Bank, like the regional banks, or through the actions of the private sector, can help at the margin, but it never makes up, never substitutes for the efforts from the countries themselves. So I would say the bulk of the financing is going to come from the countries. They're going to need help. And in some cases, that help is going to have to be quite significant if we are going to get anywhere near the targets that we've set. We can talk a little bit more, if you like, about the actual numbers involved, but I would say conceptually, that's how I think about it.
So you just quite specifically talk to the role of the development banks here in achieving the SDGs. I mean, how can they, what's their role exactly, given what you've said that the bulk of the financing will largely have to come from the countries themselves?
So development banks, in my mind, have three roles. And those are roles that help their members achieve the SDGs or to make progress on their development agenda in other ways. And the first of these roles is really to be a repository of what works and what doesn't. What's the great thing about development institutions, say like the World Bank, is that it's got close to 190 countries that are members. It has the opportunity to work and to learn from the experience of many of them and see how does education financing work in one case? What's the role of the private sector in trying to carry out infrastructure projects? And so over time, they build up a repository of understanding and good practice. So for any country, the primary role of these institutions is to provide them with the advice and the expertise that comes from this cross-country experience. The second role they have to play is to be a source of financing. And financing for long-term investments, for infrastructure, for education, for health, for all of the SDGs that you laid out, is something that some countries can mobilize from private markets. Many countries can't mobilize it on the terms or that make it affordable for them and that are feasible. So for those countries, going to these international development banks is a big part of getting the necessary financing on the long-term funding they need for long-term projects, because infrastructure projects take a long time to mature. And it's not just the World Bank and the regional banks. Increasingly, there are national and sub-regional development banks that are big players in financing development in their own country, but also in other countries. And the final role that international institutions have is to work with countries to help make sure that the money they are spending, their own money or the money they've got borrowed from others, is accompanied with the kinds of policies that will generate the outcomes that you want. So you might say, I want to do a project for expanding the supply of water. And there's an investment part to that. But if you don't have the right kinds of policies on how you price water, how do you incentivize people to come in and provide energy-saving solutions to the supply of water, then your investment is not going to pay off in terms of the same returns. So the role of the international institutions, the development banks, the IMF, when it comes to macro issues, is to help countries with the policy advice that makes the investments that they undertake deliver the returns they want and deliver them for benefits that can be shared not just by an elite in each country, but by a much larger community of their citizens.
Can I just get you to expand on something you said? Because we often, when we think of development banks, we think of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. But you just alluded to the fact that there's many more other banks that are now active in development. Can you explain that a little bit more and maybe give some examples from one particular region?
Well, I think 80 countries now have some form of development bank. Many of them are for investments, long-term investments in their own country, and sometimes they also finance projects outside. But these banks actually add up to a much larger portfolio than the World Bank and the regional development banks that we think of. Just to give you an example of one which is quite active now, it's the China Development Bank. The China Development Bank is a development bank that's been set up to finance projects in China, but also internationally. And it has a portfolio of about $2 billion. So the $2 trillion, sorry, just to get my numbers right, $2 trillion. And that just gives you a sense of how big these institutions can be.
There's a lot of talk now about blended finance. Can you explain to us what exactly that is and why are people excited about the potential of blended finance?
So blended finance, one way to think about it is to start from recognizing that the financing of development, particularly if you want to meet the SDGs, requires amounts of money that are much larger than you're going to get from development assistance or ODA, as we refer to it, overseas development assistance. So spend about $150 or so billion a year of ODA or related funding. You can get other kinds of official finance that doubles it, but really you need trillions of dollars rather than hundreds of billions of dollars to be able to finance that development. And where is this money going to come from? So as we said at the beginning, a large chunk actually comes from the countries themselves, but there's a big gap. And the expectation is that the private sector has a lot of money, pension funds, institutional investors, other investors have a lot of money, and they are looking for better returns than they can get by investing those resources in projects in rich countries where often the returns that they're getting, because those are mature markets, are relatively low. Now, how can you get this private money into financing development projects in poor countries, in middle-income countries? Sometimes there's a project which the private sector sort of looks at and says, I'm almost convinced, but really the returns don't add up to what I need to be able to make this investment, or the risks are too high, or you're asking me to finance a technology which is more climate friendly for this electric power plant, and the extra cost of that is something that I find hard to justify under my particular way of looking at projects. So in those cases, you can use some of the official money, the development financing that we have, whether it comes from countries, sometimes actually it comes from philanthropies, who want to see the private sector play a role, but they also want projects to be the right projects, to come in and blend a bit of their money, which is either grant or concessional money, with the private money, which makes the project as a whole viable for the private sector, profitable from a social point of view for the country, and sustainable. So that's the use of official money to help bring private money to finance development, which is called blended finance. That's great. I think it's worth remembering, though, that blended finance has to be approached in the same careful way as you approach any other use of public money. And blending official money with private money is not going to make something which is a bad project into a good project. You've got to actually do the careful review to make sure that the money that you're putting in is being used for a project that is fundamentally sustainable and is being used in a transparent way so people can compare and see whether this use of the limited amount of official money is better for the country and for the world as a whole than some other use for that money. So you could have used the same amount of $1 million that you're putting into a private project to make that viable. You could have used the same $1 million for doing something else, and you've got to be sure that, in fact, this is a better use.
How key is using the public money to manage the risk? I mean, we often hear that the private finance or private sector is better at dealing with risk than the public sector. But it seems to me that with blended finance, that almost gets reversed, and the public money is seen as a way of reducing the risk.
So you've got to ask what it is that you're using that money for. And sometimes private sector comes in and says, there's a risk that I see in terms of this project that comes from the uncertainty about the early stage, or because I'm not so sure about the policy commitments that the country is making, that I'll be able to actually live with them and that they'll honor them when the time comes, whether it's allowing me to transfer the money back when I've got returns from the project, whether it's making the commitments on buying some of the products or services I'm producing. For example, if I'm generating electricity and the electric power company in the country, which might be owned by the government, has made a commitment to buy that electricity from me at a certain price that makes my project viable, I don't feel 100% confident that that will happen. And I'm looking to you, the public sector, to say, well, can you help me with this? It's important that the first answer of the public sector is not to say, we'll give you a bit of money to make it viable, because there are other tools that are sometimes better at doing that. So you might say, we're going to try and reduce the risk of this project for you by giving you more information on some of the things about the country that you're feeling uncomfortable about. Or if you think there is a regulation that is creating uncertainty for all the private investors in this sector, then we can, through the policy conversation we have with the country, try to see if a different regulation could be put in place. Or you could say, well, if you're worried about the risk that comes about repatriating your money because of the political risk, well, we have a risk guarantee instrument that, for example, the Multilateral Insurance Guarantee Agency, MIGA, that is part of the World Bank Group, can provide you with that risk, which is a political risk. However, there are some risks that the private sector needs to take and manage for themselves, because that's what they're good at. So if you've got a commercial risk of how well this project is going to turn out, don't look to me to give you some assurance for that. That's what you're getting your return for. Sometimes the official funding is one of those instruments that is a better instrument than the guarantee or the policy conversation that I mentioned. But other times it's not. And I think it's very important, because that official money is scarce, that we don't rush to it as the first response to any kind of request from the private sector for help. We have to understand what is the nature of the impediment that is holding the private sector back from making the investment, and then what is the right kind of risk mitigation instrument that we, the public sector, could provide, and which we could discuss with the country to help provide, that would then overcome that impediment. And money may be an answer, but it's not automatically the right answer.
Thank you. I mean, it's really helped me to understand. I've known that risk has been right at the heart of getting this to work. So thank you for that detailed explanation. There's different types of risk, and understanding who they fall to, I think, is critical. The rate of which we're seeing private sector finance coming in, though, it's a lot less than what I think was hoped. Is it just taking a long time for it to happen, or were some of the expectations a little unrealistic, or are there obstacles that are emerging that weren't expected?
That's a really good question, Mark. I think that people are struggling to figure out what the balance is across all those different possible answers. I think that when you look at what's actually happening on the ground, first, perhaps we had assumed that there was just this stock of private sector people waiting with their checkbooks on one side and a whole bunch of shovel-ready projects on the other. And if you just sort of said go, and there'd be this match and off they would go. Turns out that a lot of private sector people are finding out what it means to be involved in these countries. They sometimes have more limits on their capacity, on their ability to take risks than we'd anticipated, and that there aren't quite as many projects that are ready. So the pipeline is also an issue, particularly in many of the low-income countries. And indeed, if you look at the numbers, it is in the low-income countries where the rate at which the private financing is materializing is the most disappointing and slower than we had anticipated. So that's kind of part of the explanation. Part of the explanation is also that it's fine to say to the official agencies, whether it's the private sector windows of the World Bank, which is the IFC, or of the regional banks, we can say to them, look, we think your role is mainly to catalyze private financing rather than to come in and do the financing yourself. But it really requires a change in their business model, because for decades now, the way they've organized their work, the way they're rewarded, the way their staff is rewarded, the way their finances are organized, it's actually from making the investment and holding it on their books. That's how they pay their bills. Mm-hmm. And now we're saying to them, you really need to think of yourselves as project facilitators rather than as project financiers. Mm-hmm. And that's a sort of mindset change. And the people who run these organizations are aware of this change and are trying to make it happen. But big ships don't turn fast. Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit of the slow turnaround from that. And then I would say the sort of final reason is that I think particularly in low-income countries, maybe we just made assumptions about how much scope there was for infrastructure to be privately financed. If you look at the world as a whole, rich countries, middle-income countries, poor countries, the vast majority of infrastructure in the world is financed by the public sector. Mm. And in low-income countries in particular, I think you can do a few things in telecoms, you can do a few things maybe even in water supply, but generally you find that the bulk of infrastructure needs are going to be met from public resources. So maybe it's a little bit of recalibration of expectations alongside looking at the obstacles that are actually stopping people on both sides of the equation from living up to the expectations.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with you. I mean, I've often hear it said that there's no shortage of, even in impact investing, there's no shortage of investors looking for projects, but the people lamenting the lack of projects, which just seems really inconsistent with the need and the number of projects where people or organisations where people are looking for money. So I think they're actually looking for a particular type of project, and I think at times there's a real misunderstanding, almost ships in the night, of what is a project and what's a project that's going to give a financial return to the investor.
But I think it's important not to sort of walk away from this agenda or give up on it, because the fundamental fact remains that for us to reach the SDGs, we're going to have to mobilize hundreds of billions of dollars of private money into the middle-income countries, into some of that into low-income countries. And I think we just need to recognize what the constraints are, work on them. Some of them the constraints are not very high level. They're just operational issues. For example, if you're a private project financier looking to work with the multilateral development banks, you need to go and talk to them about the conditions and terms they have. Each of them has a slightly different set of requirements. It has a slightly different set of forms that they want you to fill. And I think if you're a private financier, often you don't have a lot of time and institutional capacity and you want to move forward quickly. Well, maybe we can simplify some of those requirements. And again, I think that the thing that makes me optimistic is that when I talk to the leadership of these institutions, not only do they recognize the problem, they're also moving forward in trying to solve it. I think it's perhaps the shareholders, which are the countries that own these institutions, which don't send them a consistent set of messages. So we want them to work in the most risky environments, because we say that's where the value added is. Go and work in a fragile state, go and work in a low-income country. We want them to work on the more difficult projects, but we also want them to be profitable. And we also want them to do projects that don't fail. So we have a very low tolerance for failure, for project failure. we have very low tolerance for not making money, but we're also asking them to behave as risky investors in hard environments. And if you step back and say, can I do a project if those are my instructions? Well, sometimes, you're going to find it a little bit hard to find enough projects that fill all those requirements.
Yeah, no, I agree. The way you've just described it, it's a big ask. So I don't think we should be surprised that it's taking maybe a little bit longer to work out these complexities.
Or maybe we should just start changing some of our messages to these institutions. And if you say, look, what's really important is that we get them into the frontier markets, because the private sector is going to do the other easier projects in the easier markets, then we have to say it's okay if a few of the projects don't work out. We're going to look at the whole portfolio, and it's okay if the rate of return you make is not comparable to a private institution, because we put you in a different environment. And so I think we have to decide, what do we really want from these institutions? And then we've got to send their management the right set of signals.
In your role in the World Bank, I guess on a cautionary note, I mean, you were involved in a lot of debt relief.
Yeah.
So what would you caution here in terms of low and middle income countries and the sort of financing arrangements that they enter into?
Look, I would say dealing with the debt crisis is much more painful than the painful steps you have to take to stop getting into one. And difficult as the decisions are for countries and for lenders, that would slow down the flow of finance towards projects that are unsustainable, or to countries that clearly want to do things but don't have the financing capacity to manage that extra debt. History shows that going forward without being confident that you can manage the financing and the repayments will get you into a situation where dealing with the consequences through debt relief or through some kind of debt restructuring is going to take away a lot more of your energy, of the gains that come from the project, and you lose many years of your economic and development prospects. So I guess my fundamental advice at this stage is that we see in about 30 countries, low-income countries, that debt levels have gone up quite significantly over the past 5 or 6 years, and that they are either in debt difficulties or at high risk of debt difficulties. And there's a famous adage that if you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging. And I think many of these countries and their lenders, now's the time to stop digging.
I just want to ask a couple of questions about domestic constituencies. First of all, and both questions are almost two sides of the coin. The SDGs, there's a principle of universality. So it actually also applies to the poorest sections of high-income countries. So in the case of Australia, that would include Indigenous Australians, recent immigrants, sections of the drought-stricken parts of the country even. Have you had any, to what extent is that application of the SDGs to domestic population occupying the agenda?
I think if you were to look at the agenda, you would say in many countries, people are conscious of the consequences of not dealing with that agenda. And in many countries, we see that a community of people, not necessarily the poorest and most vulnerable, but a community of people, often working people, have felt that governments, the markets, the way the economy is organized, has left them behind. And that's led to a not just a resentment and sometimes a support for populist leaders and populist policies, but also a lack of trust in a breakdown of trust in the institutions of government and in the international institutions as an extension of those governments. Now, so I think the agenda and the consequences of not dealing with it is there. The two difficult issues, one is if you were to ask people, are you relating this to the SDGs? And I think you would find that the degree of awareness of that link would be pretty uneven, but doesn't stop us from focusing on the agenda. And I think that's what in this case matters. But the difficult point is that sometimes the policies that are being adopted in response to those concerns, to that feeling of being left behind, aren't necessarily going to make the lives of people better off. Because sometimes those are policies that are more protectionist, or they try to close in and become isolationist. And I don't think that that's going to lead to a big improvement in the lives of ordinary people. And the second issue is that there is a rather unfortunate sometimes setting up of the community of people who feel left behind and the groups that you mentioned, which are sometimes the most vulnerable. So, you might say the people who you mentioned, new immigrants, or in the case of Australia, indigenous people, or in other countries, you have very poor people. Refugees, or even people who have been born in the country, but for many generations, their families have lived there, but they are just people who've not been part of that mainstream economy. And their needs and the needs of the people who feel left behind by globalization are really common issues that need to be addressed by policies that are going to be more responsive to reducing inequalities, to helping spread the social network and welfare. But they're sometimes presented as being at odds with each other rather than as being a common agenda. And I think that's important to address, because if we look forward now, you can see inequality has really increased in so many countries, rich countries, over the last 2 decades. And the combination of rising inequality, of the numbers of people who feel and are struggling to make ends meet, and where they don't see the prospects for their children as being even as good as their own, and their own prospects haven't been that great for the last 2 decades. I think that creates a difficult social and political environment within which to make the kinds of policy choices that would be more inclusive.
Of course, the other side of the coin is that, and this I think applies to all sections of a high-income country, that there is a trend towards more inward-looking national policies rather than often a reduction of aid assistance. So what are the challenges here to make the constituencies of high-income countries to understand the importance of the increasing ODA and other financing instruments so that we can achieve the SDGs across the globe?
I think what we have to explain but do a better job of than we've done so far is to explain the interlinkages now, the interconnections that bind us all together. And the global challenges that we face are not going to stop at borders. So whether it's pandemics, any kind of disease that spreads across the world is not going to stop at your border. So you've got to help strengthen the systems and the health systems and the capacity to tackle those diseases around the world, including in poor countries where they don't have that capacity. Whether it's the impact of climate change on food production, on drought, on weather. It's not going to be sorted out unless you engage globally on those issues. Whether it's a question of artificial intelligence and the rules by which we are going to govern the ethics of artificial intelligence, which is changing the whole nature of our world, how are we going to create a global set of norms that will help to guide how we use artificial intelligence for good rather than for evil in the future? Whether it's a question of looking at how migration is going to be managed when there is such a large demographic difference in different parts of the world. In Africa, over the next 20, 30 years, 800 million young people are going to come into the labor market. And how will they find a project for their lives? What number of them will be looking to find work and lives abroad rather than within Africa? And how we ensure that this is done in a way that is managed and organized rather than chaotic and leading to friction and social unrest. These are all challenges that require us to work across borders and as a global community. And I think the time has come for us to stop thinking of development as an us and them proposition. It's not just about what can we do to help poor people elsewhere. It's about how can we work with countries around the world to deal with common challenges, and improving the living standards in those countries is necessary to be able to enable them to deal with those common challenges. Because if they're going to be stuck in a trap of poverty and disease, and if you're not providing your share in helping them to get out of that situation, it's going to be very hard then to expect that the kinds of common challenges that we all face are going to be addressed adequately in those circumstances. And I think that's the narrative change that we have to bring about.
Masood, I mean, that's a wonderful note to finish the interview. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity.